oldest living descendant of Winnifred Eaton, but here I am. I enthusiastically welcome you to this epical, amazing conference, which honors the centenary of a book that is signified in my life, and even more so, the remarkable woman who wrote it. I am joined by some of the other descendants of Winnie, as she has come to be called by both family and the loose band who call ourselves Winniers. That is, those who have delighted in studying and writing about her. My own son Paul is here, as well as Frank and Elizabeth Rooney, two of the children of Winnie's only other grandchild, my first cousin, Dr. Paul Rooney, known as Tim. When I came to write the biography of Winnifred, it was Tim I followed around for weeks, pertinaciously asking questions about our mutual grandmother. What was her voice like? Did she laugh a lot? Was she outrageous? How tall was she? What did she like to read? How was her cooking? What were her politics? Was she prejudiced against Jews? Did she get along with her daughter Doris? Was she bad-tempered, elated, emotional? What? Etc., etc. Tim, a mathematics professor with prodigious memory right up to his death at age 91 in 2016, had grown up in our grandmother's house in both Los Angeles and here in Calgary. When she died, he was in his late 20s, so he was uniquely able and willing to transmit his minutest recollections of her to me. He was the chief encourager and champion of what became the biography I wrote, which was published by the University of Illinois Press. So now I, 1/8 chinois, as we say in the family, and Winnie's great-grandchildren, 1/16, are all proud to be celebrating our honorable, eccentric, talented, and puzzling ancestress here today. And I know that Tim and his mother Doris would feel fulfilled by this fruition of their wishes and vision. As for Winnie herself, I have over the last 20 years or so learned enough about her to know that her pride and joy would be larger than life at this conference, as would her astonishment. As any of you who have read my book will know, I myself only met her once. I was about 4 or 5 years old when she visited me in New York, where I was being brought up by my mother's parents, a Jewish academic couple, the Finkelsteins. They introduced this strange lady to me as my grandmother, and I immediately insisted that she couldn't be. I already had a grandmother. When they insisted that yes, she was, I thereby pronounced, "You're my bad grandma." Her hurt feelings were evident, which is why I so vividly still remember the incident as a painful one. Still, I do like to think that possibly I have made it up to her by now. By learning her life story, reading all her books, studying the culture and ethnic circumstances in which she grew up, and telling her story as fully as possible, not as fiction or as familial hagiography, but in an attempt to comprehend the reality of the flamboyant, complex character of my unknown grandmother. Now, I grew up in New York City, knowing almost nothing about her. My mother, Helen Finkelstein, was mentally ill, and my father, Paul Eaton Reeve, Winnie's son, the Greenwich Village poet, was an alcoholic, and almost worse in my family's eyes, not Jewish, and so I was not permitted to see him. I can only recall a couple of glimpses of my father, and so he was never able to tell me about his mother or his own upbringing. I found out much more later, reading his tragic letters to his mother, mostly begging for money, in which you could heartbreakingly trace his downward, unstoppable, tragic arc. His letters also showed his intellect and talent, as well as his sorrow at being kept from his only child. In one letter to his sister Doris, who lived here in Calgary, he wrote how he wished that their great children could meet. They would love each other. Many years later, this came true. In another letter, my father expressly said he wished he could write a biography of his mother, that she deserved one, that she wasn't properly appreciated. But he was too far gone and died in 1961 when I was 15. By then, my Jewish grandparents had died, and I was essentially a waif. My father's life in the village had ended only a year or two before my own 1960s beatnik phase began, in the same city where we had lived but not known each other. I went to his funeral, where I was startled when 2 tiny, elderly Asian women wearing deep black veils were introduced to me as my father's aunts. They were my great aunts, Winnie's sisters, Florence and Beryl. They peered at me with intense interest, and one smiled and said, "You didn't even know your father had aunts, did you?" Soon after that, my Aunt Doris sent me a copy of the very book that is the subject of this conference, Cattle, and it became an important fairy token to me. That wasn't from reading it, however. At the time, I didn't relate to the book at all. What did a New York teenage hippie chick know or care about Chinooks and bulls and riding the range? The book had a loud, plain orange cover and an inscription to my dear friend Fanny Holtzman. I was mystified by how this raw Western, I don't think I even read as far as the rape, came to be written by someone who I'd been told was supposed to be Chinese or Japanese or something. I wondered what kind of writer had such an inexplicable background. It only comes together if you know about her life, but I didn't. Yet the mere knowledge of the book's existence was enough to put it into my mind that I had a literary lady for an ancestor. And being a compulsive reader and scribbler myself, I began to wonder if maybe I could be such a one too. We heard of Winnie's death when I was about 8, and I was not supposed to know or care. But my path crossed with her again, as it were, when I moved to Los Angeles from New York in the early 1970s. I just graduated from CCNY, and I could type. I had a small child, was a stranger in town, and needed a job pronto. Unexpectedly, my Aunt Doris, with whom I had an occasional distant correspondence, made a practical suggestion that bore fruit. She suggested that I look up her mother's old literary agent, Ben Medford, who was still alive. I did, and this elderly gentleman, bow-tied, red-gray hair, retired but still sprightly, took me under his wing. "You're a smart girl," he said. "You should write for the movies like your grandmother did." That seemed a bit far-fetched, but he gave me a bunch of scripts and I wrote coverage for him. Synopses and comments, evaluating them as film projects. He couldn't pay me, but took me out to meals. He took me out to meals and a few screenings. When I had coverage samples in hand, I went to the then Yellow Pages and called 25 movie-related companies and wound up with my first job in the movie business as reader at a literary agency. That is how I got my career, and I worked for decades as the book person, story analyst at Warner Brothers, reading novels, until I retired 8 years ago. I never did become a screenwriter like my grandmother, but I worked in story departments all my working life. She had done some of the same work, as did my father for a while, and later my son. We are the only family who has worked in Hollywood story departments for 4 generations. This reliably supported me and my family, and my own writing as well. And most of mine has been Jane Austen-related fiction, essays, and now plays. I had one that played in Australia last week, and it has just struck me that in preparing this talk, that my ending up as a playwright does have some echoes of my grandmother. If I had an ambition left, it would be to write and play her in a one-woman show. However, fear not, this will do very nicely indeed. It is too bad that the one thing I did not do was question Ben Medford much about her. He clearly had liked and respected her, thought she was brilliant, and 20 years after she died, he cared enough to help her granddaughter get started in her career. But I had no inkling then that a quarter century later, I would become her biographer. I was too shy to question him, and he didn't offer stories, which is something I regret. Years later, when I was writing the book, I did encounter another person who'd known Winnie in her heyday. This was the woman who'd been fired from her job in 1924 as story editor of Universal Pictures to make way for Winnie, who was protege of studio chief Carl Laemmle. This lady was now over 100 years old and in a nursing home. We talked on the phone, and it was sort of amusing that her rage and resentment about being displaced by such a worthless and capable person as she made Winnie out to be still rankled. A grudge that had never been forgotten, nursed for 3/4 of a century. But when I did eagerly ask questions, she thought better of it and would not answer. "Ah, my dear," she said, "it was so long ago, and it's wrong to speak ill of the dead or raise sad memories. If only she had." But I could not get another word out of her on the subject. So it was that when my Aunt Doris died in 1977, I still did not know even the basic facts of Winnie's life. But by then I was 30, had more confidence and curiosity. So I flew here to Calgary to see Tim and go to his mother's funeral. And that was when I suddenly got my sudden and complete immersion into things Winnie. All at once I learned that yes, it was true, I had Chinese blood. She was half Chinese, and Tim told me the strange story of her Japanese persona and about her marriages, her children, her books. Her books were all there in the house, and I sat right down and read the one that seemed most appealing to me. Me. And there she was, a real voice, instantly recognizable as such. After years of story analysis work, I saw she possessed the rare gift of compelling, page-turning storytelling that has a price above rubies in a story department. I knew exactly how to value that. And her own story, the publicity device of the anonymous authorship, the Who's the Author of Me book campaign, was stunning. But what I most intensely related to was her personality. I identified at once with her energy, her ambition, her bounding narcissism, and way of conveying urgency and emotion. She wrote, "I think I had the most acute, inquiring, and eager mind of any girl of my age in the world. I had always secretly believed there were the strains of genius somewhere hidden in me." I laughed at the ludicrous outrageousness, but recognized a similarity in my own foibles. She had started out from nothing, had a hard life, wasn't born with a silver spoon, had to seek her own success and claw her way up, not unlike me, though much more dramatically. I saw peace rather than money. She would not have approved of that at all. But what she called the fairy germs struck home. In me, describing her romantic rival, no, she was not better than I. Strip her of her glittering clothes, put her in rags over a wash tub, and she would have been transformed into a common thing. But if you put me over a wash tub, I tell you, I would have woven a romance. From the very suds. God had planted in me the fairy germs. That I knew. Well, after reading that, the thing was done. I was a lost soul. My grandmother had the fairy germs, her expression of her writing talent. And sitting there reading this for the first time, how could I not believe that I might have inherited the echo of them? So I went home and started collecting all her books in used bookshops and corresponded with Tim, who told me about the academics who were starting to write to him to seek information. One was Amy Ling. She's really the first Winnier, but she didn't have anybody else to Winnie with, so maybe she wasn't. Who had it in her mind to write about Winnie. But in her illness, Tim suggested she pass her notes on to me, which she generously did. They both hoped I would write about Winnie, and I was ripe for persuasion. By the late 1990s, I had written 5 novels, but had never been published, though I'd come very close. But close, no cigar, you know. I had excellent training in writing essays on deadline in my work, and had developed writing skills through complete immersion in Jane Austen, the world's best stylistic writing teacher, in my opinion. So, when Annette White Parks's biography of Susan Farr came out, it struck me that now Winnie would surely be next, and some professor, was going to have the opportunity to write about her. To me, a much more fascinating subject than Edith, for her life was a page-turner entire. Why should it not be me who had that opportunity? So I sent an email to the university press that had published the Susan Farr book, and quickly received an answer within hours, now that email was invented, that showed me that I would not be an unpublished writer. I came here to the University of Calgary and immersed myself in the archives, those paper boxes full of very fragile papers, amusing the librarians by my personal take on the discoveries therein, such as the letters between Doris and Winnie and my New York grandparents as to where this inconvenient baby, me, should be placed in 1946. Okay. I saw the moment when my life's fate was decided. Should the child grow up in Calgary or New York? American or Canadian? Jewish or not Jewish? Little multiculturalism there, enough to give me some slight sense of Winnie's more pronounced multicultural crossings. I also had that unique experience of reading all Winnie's story department notes, which were very like the ones I was so familiar with. The movie business had not essentially changed that much between my grandmother's time and mine, at least not in story departments. Even though the next big thing differs in different decades, the underlying principles and goals are always the same: money. As I got down to the work, I knew that writing would not be the problem. I could do that, the fairy germs, you know. But I had more doubt about my researching skills and the giant gaps in my knowledge. Jane Austen could only take me so far in this project, and my model for a biography, James Pope Hennessy's Queen Mary, was neither here nor there. My Hollywood expertise was very useful, but what about my complete ignorance of Asian American history and literature? But everything about the entire project, from start to finish, fell into my life and my lap with almost magical serendipity in a way I'd never known before. I used to do my reading at a coffee shop near my home in Santa Monica called the Novel Cafe. One day, a UCLA graduate student friend of mine, Michelle McAvoy, informed me excitedly that, as unlikely as it sounded, she had met a PhD candidate from Poland who was working on the Eaton sisters. At that time, there were not many people who knew about them. Of course, we had to meet, and that was how I did meet Dominika Ferenc, who took me in hand and kindly, she's blushing, and kindly and painstakingly taught me what I needed to know about research and scholarship in order to produce a respectable semi-academic work with no qualifications higher than a BA from CCNY. I learned what books I urgently needed to read to make me semi-capable of my self-chosen assignment. Dominika and I met regularly for library sessions every week, and I hope I was able to help her in some less important ways, family information and so on. I learned that sharing work was not that common among academics, but our projects, though different, were interlinked enough to be mutually enlightening and helpful. Along the way, we were joined by other scholars, such as Jean Lee Cole. Another, Karen Skenazy, like Dominika, is here today to help us celebrate the person, this long and happy association of Winnie years. At the time, as you know, Winnie was categorized as the bad sister and Edith the good one, but I could see that that was simplistic and unfair. Sometimes I liked her, identifying with her as we biographers often do. Sometimes she almost disgusted me. The haphazard way she conducted her life, though exciting, had another side as she leaped back and forth between success and disaster. Her mothering seemed uncertain. Her oldest son, Perry, became schizophrenic in his early 20s and lived into his 60s, incarcerated in Camarillo, a locked lifetime institution for the mentally ill. Winnie visited him in Canada and California some years, also spending time with her movie business friends and staying at the Miramar Hotel, which still stands 3 blocks from my home. A second son died in babyhood from being dropped on his head by a nurse on her suburban New York estate. With her only daughter, Doris, who became assistant to Winnie's second husband, Frank Reeve, she seemed to have a rather fraught relationship. The two were opposites. Doris as practical as Winnie was fanciful. Then there was my father. As the only child of hers to have a brilliant writing talent, she pushed him as a 20-year-old famous poet. But he could never live up to her publicity and disappointed her at every stage of his life. Yet one of the things Winnie was working so hard for was her family. As a young woman, she boasted with jollity that she turned out a book and a baby a year. After her son, Paul, was cut off from the family, she could not touch her husband's money to help him, and I think that dimmed her spirit, rather. Winnie always had imagination, though, and drive to burn, and the Calgary Archives provided abundant evidence that she was an incredibly hard worker. She battled the odds in Hollywood as a woman and as an Asian American, given hack assignments, but fighting tooth and nail with determination in thankless and unglamorous conditions. At the same time, the destructive fallout of some parts of her life resonated in her own descendants' lives long after her death. This gave me a long-range picture of family dynamics and the handing down of traits that could be both gifts and curses. On balance, I ended up admiring her more than not. Strong-willed, pioneering, and original. I even came to admire her cattle, and can now see all the richly observed, strong narrative and descriptive qualities that had passed me by at 15. That was how I came to see her while I was writing about her, but that was more than 20 years ago that I was doing all the work. I am now growing old myself. I am at the age when Winnie felt her own age, and not far from the age at which she died. Well, now we have better, blood pressure medication. At the time, I didn't think much about her saying when my father suggested in one of his letters that she write for TV. No, that's a young person's game. I'm too old. My mind still teems with stories, but I haven't the energy. I'm pretty close to feeling that way myself now, especially in this year when my own husband Peter has died at exactly the age Winnie was, just before his 59th birthday. Winnie felt her day was over, and my father wrote, "She is afraid she will not be remembered." Yet how astonished, as I say, they would both be if they could see us here today. Winnie isn't forgotten. There's a whole new legacy now, a new generation of scholars who have arisen just since my own book was published. The discoveries of the last 20 years, most especially by the esteemed Mary Chapman, have been intensely exciting and revealing. Who knew that my great-grandmother was really a trapeze artist kidnapped from a Chinese circus? That my great-grandfather was jailed for smuggling Chinese people across the border? Can anyone have ever imagined that here, this coming Saturday morning, there will be a reading of part of Winnie's play adapted from Tama, written over 100 years ago, with her granddaughter reading the part of Tama and her great-grandson reading Tojin? It's incredible. Perhaps most important, though, is that re-examination of the meaning of Winnie's life and work have opened up new worlds of scholarship. I have not personally followed these aspects as much as I should, which is yet another reason I'm vitally interested and so glad to be here now as this conference opens. I will revel in what I learn here, and I know we all will. As Winnie herself might say, let the show begin.